Hi, everyone. My discussion today is focusing on a paper that comes from a bigger study that looked at sexual harassment at the workplace. And my discussion is focusing on social and gender norms, informing, voicing, and reporting against sexual harassment among domestic workers in Kampala. Kampala is Uganda's capital, and so it's a collection of several groups of people that come from different rural regions of the country. And most of their reason for coming is the search for employment. So in a way of situating domestic work in Uganda, it's mainly done by young women. Majority of the employees are young women, although they are men, young men, and also the elder women. But it's a female-dominated sector, and it goes as low as 13 years. But for this paper, we focused on young women between 18 and 24 years of age. So many of these are from low-income families. They mainly less educated. Majority had dropped out of primary school, although there were few that had progressed to secondary, and many of them had come from rural areas. So rural urban migration was a great contributor to domestic workers in Kampala. Many of the ways in which they get employment is through social networks. So there are no formal structures for recruitment, retention, or payment. It's mainly through the social networks, the informal networks that many of these people have. So the networks do the negotiation, they do, the terms of reference, but it's all informal. There's nothing that has been written on what one expects. For instance, none of the people we talked to had a formal contract. Many of them were working informally on oral contracts, and which had been made by the parties that formed the employment. They were earning very low money. Many of them they ranged from $15 to $30 per month. At least that was by 2020. This was expected to have gone low due to COVID-19. So the situation isn't getting any better. The other thing that's important to acknowledge is that they work in isolated settings. They live within the home, within the homes. They are living domestic workers of their bosses, and then they have limited access to information and networks, or maybe even moving out. So they have to be confined in the settings of the bosses. So we feel it's important to appreciate the intersection between gender and social norms in influencing how individuals and also institutions operate. So, what someone believes should be done and what the institution also believes, because they don't operate in a vacuum. They are all anchored into the social, and many of the social norms are also gender norms. So we are bringing out these two as an intersection of norms that inform voicing and reporting, especially in relation to sexual harassment. In understanding this, we need to look at some of the key features that are really that really inform the reporting. We look at marriage, social norms relating to marriage, social norms relating to masculinity and femininity, then sex and sexuality, but also language. So from here, I want to quickly run to the findings of the study. So we realized that there were serious discrepancies between the formally acceptable language in terms of reporting, and also the language that young women use amongst themselves, among their peers. So they explained that it's very clear to talk about sex and sexual harassment when they're talking amongst themselves. They have words that they use. They have slangs, they have some words that's really cut across, and they understand each other very well with no difficulty. But when it comes to formal reporting, the police requires them to be so explicit and very direct in terms of what has happened, how it happened, and all those details. But remember, they are socially trained that some words are not just said, especially when it comes to sex and sexuality. You can't just say what you feel. You have to cover up. You camouflage, you find a way of covering your words so they don't sound obscene to the person you're reporting to. So here, these young women are held up in a double situation where they are reporting to people who are older than them, but then in most cases, they're also a different gender. So you can see you're speaking to an elderly man and you can't just speak out these words as the elder man wants to hear them, because socially you're supposed to be looked at as someone who's humble and you can't be perverted. So they struggle with this, and it makes many of the cases fail because then the police don't have the words that the court wants to hear. In addition to the language, there's also the aspect of privacy, especially at the reporting centers. I have an example of a young lady who notes that when she went to report, in the room, there were several people that were reporting different cases. Some were to do with land, others were to do with money laundering, and here she was talking about sexual harassment. So she tried to speak softly to the officer who was making the file, but the officer could not understand. So the officer, she also happened to be a woman, shouted rudely, "If you cannot speak, then go out. I have other things to do." So the young woman narrated how hard it was. And that was the last time she ever went back to report the case. Then we have another case of marriage. Socially, a key informant noted that some parents keep persuading their daughters to get married. And this creates unnecessary pressure for these young women. So when a man approaches them, it doesn't matter whichever way he comes, they tend to think maybe his potential married partner that can be presented to the parents. So young women in the process end up accepting and accommodating harassment in belief that maybe it can result into marriage. In such cases, they don't even report at all. So social norms relating to masculinity and femininity dictate that, males are free to express themselves sexually, publicly, by touching women's bodies. That's accommodatable. But then for women, they're supposed to be submissive and, shy and act and present their bodies in attractive ways. So this puts up a dilemma, because then it gets confusing for these women. When do I report? When do I know the right person? When is harassment, given that I'm expected to be submissive? So yeah, amidst other things, I want to run to the conclusion. And in conclusion, we believe that domestic work is crucial and it's important for the development of the country. Because as we encourage women to take up public roles, to take up employment in the public space, to get into politics and leadership, it means there's a gap that's left behind in the domestic space. And women have to look for less privileged women to come and take up this role, which means it's important that we look at domestic work as work. So we call upon formalization of domestic work, and government needs to look at it as a form of work. The Employment Act talks about housemates and not workers, which means they're not governed by other laws that relate to workers. Then when you look at the Sexual Harassment Act, the Anti-Sexual Harassment Bill, it looks at that companies that employ more than 25 people should have an anti-sexual harassment policy. Meaning if you're one working in a domestic space, you're not catered for. So these things need to be resolved. Then there's also need to transform social norms towards gender equality. We shouldn't expect women to be looked at as objects, and the sexualization that goes on needs to stop. We need to change attitudes and encourage people to speak out. Let young women speak out, just to try to break, the barriers that are in there. Thank you.